saying something about the big picture of what the Federalists thought how constitutional politics would work under the US Constitution. Now, in part, this goes back to the famous Federalist Papers. Just to place them on the table, we've all heard about them, but, what were they? So they end up being a series of 85 essays printed in newspapers, and they were designed to persuade critics about why the new Constitution was a good idea. They were written really in the context of the ratification battle that happened in Alexander Hamilton's New York. So Hamilton's reading some of the anti-federalist ideas, and these are some ideas that need to be answered. And so he gets his group together, and so he calls in James Madison, he calls in John Jay. They get together to write the Federalist Papers, in part to explain, why the Constitution is constructed the way it is, why the Articles of Confederation need to be replaced, what some of the big ideas are behind the US Constitution. And so they end up dividing up the essays. Hamilton writes the most essays. He writes 51. James Madison writes 29. John Jay writes 5. In the end, it's very hard to generalize about what the founding generation envisioned about the Constitution as a whole, but there is a certain vision that emerges unmistakably from the Federalist Papers. And so, if we're thinking about the big vision here, it's that the founders, in designing their new government, they're in part concerned, of course, about government abuse of power and tyranny. Still in their minds is the American Revolution, where they cast aside a powerful and distant parliament and King George III in order to be able to govern ourselves. And so there's a sense we don't want to get rid of that distant government run by elites, people who are out of touch with the rest of us and don't know at all what's happening in America, and put in place a new national government that's distant and out of touch. And so there is a sense in which we're creating a new national government of limited powers. They are concerned about abuses of power. They understand that it's part of human nature to grasp for as much power as you can, to seize it, and often to abuse it. And so they want to guard against that. And so in part, that's why we end up with the story that Madison tells in Federalist 51, separation of powers, checks and balances, ambition counteracting ambition, all of those ways in which we have checks in place to avoid the abuse of power. But there's also a positive vision of what American constitutional politics was supposed to be under this new Constitution. The founders also wanted to create a national government that worked, one that could address genuinely national problems, one that could raise an army, one that could regulate commerce between the states, one that could put down mob violence, one that could keep the American people safe, because fresh in their minds isn't just the American Revolution, it's the failures of the Articles of Confederation. So they're looking to create a new national government that's stronger than the national government created by the Articles of Confederation, but also one of limited powers. And that's such a hard and delicate balance to strike. It's one that we debate all the way up to this day. For a republic to succeed, the founders understood that we required a virtuous people and a virtuous set of leaders. So in part, the Constitution setting up a structure to restrict the powers of the national government, but in part, it's also trying to set up a national government that attracts the best and the brightest into government so that we can have a government that's driven by what the founders would have called civic republican virtue. They were concerned about factions. They were concerned about the development of political parties. They were concerned about governments filled with elected officials who are there to serve their parties, serve their factions, serve their own self-interests. And they were also concerned with an American people that could be corrupted by such a political system, not in the sense of bribery and all of this, but our very souls that will be infected by factional politics, by party passion, and not have the ability to think for ourselves and to apply reason to the policy issues of the day. And so their hope was to create a structure that could allow for a government that was driven by civic republican virtue, this idea that we want a government that's driven by reason, not passion, deliberation, not just yelling at one another, a concern for the public good, not for private self-interest. Here's how James Madison put it in Federalist number 57. He said, the aim of every political constitution was first to obtain for rulers men who possess most wisdom to discern and most virtue to pursue the common good of society. So we want a new national government that attracts America's best and brightest, and also virtuous leaders like George Washington. Those are the sorts of people that we want in government. We're going to have a bunch of political leaders that can, in the end, lead important public debates and shape public opinion. hopefully promote deliberation. And here's how Madison said, this is how he envisioned the system in Federalist 10. He hoped that it would refine and enlarge the public's views by passing them through the medium of a chosen body of citizens whose wisdom may best discern the interests of their country and whose patriotism and love of justice would be least likely to sacrifice it to temporary or partial consideration. So the idea is you're going to set up a positive feedback loop of civic Republican virtue. You're going to attract the best and the brightest. They're actually going to come into our government. They're going to govern well. The American people are then going to trust this new national government and rinse and repeat. And over time, you're going to have a republic that works, and that is going to then interact with that system of checks and balances and make sure that as new ideas emerge, that they're tested. They're tested by competitive elections, by separation of powers, by checks and balances, by things like the presidential veto and judicial review. The bad ones are going to be tossed out. The flawed ones are going to be made better. The good ones are going to be made great. And that in the end, we're going to end up with policy that promotes the common good. At least that's the theory.